It was 3:15 a.m. on a rain-soaked Tuesday when Quinn Vance finally clocked out of Mercy General Hospital. The red digits on the time clock blinked once before settling, indifferent to the weight of the moment. Quinn stood there a second longer than necessary, her ID badge still dangling from her neck, her fingers slow to move as if removing it might make everything real. Her scrubs were stained with blood and antiseptic, the faint smell of both clinging to her skin. Her hands trembled, not from exhaustion alone, but from shock. She had just been fired. Not suspended. Not written up. Fired. 30 years of nursing. 20 of them spent inside these walls. And it ended in a windowless break room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a man half her age telling her she was a liability. Quinn swallowed and forced herself to breathe. She had learned long ago that emotions were luxuries best handled later, after the patient was stable, after the bleeding stopped. Right now, she just needed to leave. She turned toward the exit, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor. The night shift staff moved around her like ghosts, avoiding her eyes. They already knew. In hospitals, news traveled faster than infection. A few hours ago, they had trusted her with their lives. Now, no one wanted to be seen with the nurse who had crossed administration. Her locker was empty. Her badge was gone. All that remained of her career fit into a cheap tote bag pressed tight against her chest. As she walked, Quinn's thoughts spiraled despite her efforts to keep them in check. Her savings were nearly gone, drained by her husband's cancer treatments before he passed 3 years earlier. Her daughter was away at college. This job, this exhausting, thankless job, had been her anchor. And now it was gone. She reached the main lobby, where the glass walls revealed Chicago drowning in rain. Streetlights blurred into streaks of white and amber, neon signs melting into the darkness. Thunder rumbled somewhere far off, low and distant, like an approaching storm that had waited years to arrive. Quinn stepped toward the automatic doors. They exploded open. The sudden blast of cold air and rain was sharp, violent. The doors slammed against their tracks with a metallic hiss, and the entire lobby seemed to freeze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Footsteps stopped. Even the ever-present hospital machines seemed to hold their breath. 6 men entered. They moved with a purpose that didn't belong in a hospital, measured, synchronized, lethal. Each of them was built like a wall of muscle wrapped in tactical gear, their boots heavy against the floor, water dripping from their vests and sleeves. They weren't police. They weren't security. Quinn knew that instinctively. These men carried a weight that went beyond authority. A darker gravity. The kind earned in places most people never see. Navy SEALs. Every nerve in Quinn's body went tight. Her heart slammed against her ribs as fear surged hot and fast. Had she broken a law she didn't understand? Was this about the medication? Had someone decided compassion was a crime? The man at the front stopped directly in front of her. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of rain and her own unsteady breathing. Then the impossible happened. The giant soldier dropped to one knee. He looked up at her, not with suspicion or anger, but with reverence, and spoke a single word that shattered everything she thought she knew. "Ma'am." The fluorescent lights in the break room buzzed like trapped insects, drilling straight into Quinn Vance's skull. She sat on the vinyl couch with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the faint chemical smell of disinfectant mixing with cold coffee and stress. 12 hours in trauma had already drained her dry, but this was worse. Marcus Sterling stood in front of her, blocking the only exit. He was young, immaculate, and painfully out of place in a hospital. His tailored suit looked like it belonged in a boardroom, not a space where nurses collapsed between codes. He tapped at his tablet with a manicured finger, scrolling through reports he barely understood, his expression fixed somewhere between annoyance and smug authority. "I don't care about the Hippocratic Oath right now, Quinn," Sterling said without looking up. "I care about the budget variance report." Quinn lifted her eyes slowly. Her voice, when she spoke, was hoarse from dehydration and shouting orders over trauma alarms all night. Mr. Sterling, the patient, Mr. Henderson, was going into septic shock. He didn't have insurance information. If I hadn't opened that antibiotic cache, he would be dead. Not later. Now. Sterling sighed, the sound long and exaggerated, as if she were a stubborn child. And because you bypassed authorization to access restricted, high-cost medication for a John Doe, you flagged us for an audit. Do you have any idea how much that drug costs per dose? He's a human being, Quinn snapped, surprised by the steel in her own voice. And he's a veteran. He said it while he was delirious. Sterling finally looked up, a thin smile tugging at his lips. They all say that. It gets them sympathy. The words landed like a slap. Quinn stared at him, the exhaustion in her bones suddenly edged with something hotter. Anger. Grief. Disbelief. She had watched men die with more dignity than this conversation. This isn't the first time you've gone rogue, Sterling continued. You prioritize emotion over protocol. Mercy General is a business. We can't afford bleeding hearts. He straightened, adjusting his cuffs. Pack your locker. You're suspended pending a formal review on Monday. But between us. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You're done here. Start looking at nursing homes. The silence that followed pressed in on Quinn's chest. For a moment, she thought she might cry. 30 years of discipline held the tears back, locking them behind her eyes where they burned. She had worked disasters, epidemics, mass casualty events. She had held strangers as they took their last breath. She refused to break now, especially not in front of him. Quinn nodded once. She stood, her knees protesting, and brushed past Sterling without another word. His cologne lingered in the air, sharp and artificial. Hand in your badge at security, he called after her. The hallway outside felt colder. Nurses she had trained avoided her gaze. Doctors she had saved from mistakes suddenly found charts fascinating. The message was clear, association was dangerous. At her locker, Quinn moved slowly, deliberately. She packed her stethoscope, a gift from her late father, into her tote. She added a worn photo of her daughter, smiling on a college campus far away. Finally, she peeled off her ID badge. Quinn Vance, RN. Head trauma nurse. The plastic felt heavier than it should have. She closed the locker and walked away, unaware that this was not the end of her story, but the moment it began to change. The rain outside Mercy General had intensified, hammering against the glass like thrown gravel. Quinn Vance stood near the main exit, her tote bag clutched tightly to her chest, as if holding it together might somehow hold her life together too. The hospital lobby felt cavernous at that hour, too bright, too clean, and painfully quiet. Arthur, the night security guard, stood behind the desk nearby, watching her with soft, sympathetic eyes. Rough night, he said gently. Quinn managed a tired nod. You could say that. She stepped toward the automatic doors. Before they could slide open, a violent wash of white light cut through the rain outside. The glow wasn't from ambulances. It was sharper, brighter, high-intensity beams that sliced through the storm like blades. Arthur squinted, stepping closer to the glass. What in the world, he muttered. The screech of tires followed. 3 massive, unmarked black SUVs skidded into the ambulance bay with aggressive precision, blocking the entrance in a maneuver that was anything but accidental. The engines didn't idle. They growled, low and threatening, like restrained animals. Arthur took an unconscious step back. We didn't get a call for a VIP, he said, his voice tight. And that's definitely not police. Quinn turned slowly. Something deep in her chest tightened, not fear exactly, but recognition. She had seen this kind of movement before. Long ago. In places she tried not to remember. The SUV doors flew open in perfect synchronization. 6 men stepped out into the pouring rain. They didn't rush. They advanced with deliberate control, each step measured, aware of every angle, every possible threat. Heavy tactical vests weighed down their broad frames. Holsters hugged their thighs. Combat boots splashed through puddles without hesitation. These men weren't law enforcement. They were operators. The automatic doors hissed open as they entered the lobby, dragging cold rain and storm air in with them. Water streamed from their gear, pooling on the polished floor. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, not from the cold, but from the presence they carried with them. Everything stopped. A patient in the waiting area dropped his magazine. A triage nurse froze with the phone halfway to her ear. The low hum of the hospital suddenly felt unbearably loud. The lead man, a giant with a thick beard and a jagged scar through one eyebrow, scanned the room with eyes that missed nothing. His gaze moved like a weapon, sharp and assessing. Marcus Sterling came hustling down the administrative corridor, his expensive shoes clicking in a frantic rhythm. He took in the mud, the wet floor, the weapons. "You can't bring firearms in here." Sterling barked, voice cracking. "This is a sterile environment." "I'm the chief of administration." The bearded man walked past him without a glance. Sterling tried to grab his arm. The soldier stopped. "Sir," he said calmly, turning his head just enough for Sterling to see his eyes, "step aside or be removed." Sterling recoiled as if struck. The soldier's attention shifted. Straight to Quinn. She felt it instantly, the weight of his focus locking onto her like a spotlight. Her heart stuttered. Her back pressed against the wall as he began walking toward her, each step echoing in the stunned silence. Thud. 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 Her legs wouldn't move. Questions flooded her mind. Had Sterling called someone? Was this about the medication? Had she broken a law she didn't know existed? The soldier stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close, he was immense. He smelled of rain, gun oil, and old tobacco. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed his ballistic sunglasses. The hardness in his eyes vanished. Replaced by something that stole Quinn's breath. Respect. He snapped his heels together and saluted. "Ma'am." Behind him, 5 more operators snapped to attention, saluting in perfect unison. The hospital lobby fell into a silence so complete it felt sacred. And Quinn Vance, fired nurse, stood trembling at the center of it, about to learn who she truly was to these men. For a long moment, Quinn Vance simply stared at the man saluting her. The word "ma'am" still echoed in her ears, unreal and heavy, as if it had been spoken in another language. Her mind struggled to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. 6 elite operators, soaking wet and armed to the teeth, standing at rigid attention, for her. Her fingers tightened around the straps of her tote bag. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely carrying. The lead soldier held the salute for another heartbeat, then relaxed. When he spoke again, his voice lost none of its gravity, but something warmer threaded through it. "Yes, you do, ma'am. You just don't remember yet." Quinn's breath caught as she looked into his eyes. Up close, the scar through his eyebrow was unmistakable. The piercing blue eyes. The familiar set of his jaw. Memory slammed into her like a physical blow. Dust. Fire. The scream of rotors. Blood pooling on canvas. Her tote slipped from her numb fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. "Jackson," she breathed. The giant soldier's mouth curved into a slow, exhausted smile. "Still got it," he said quietly. "Jackson Reaper Thorne." Emotion surged up her throat, sharp and sudden. "You were dead," she said, tears blurring her vision. "Your vitals flatlined. On the helicopter. I saw it." "I'm hard to kill," Jackson replied. Always have been. He gestured behind him. So are they. Because of you. Marcus Sterling found his voice then. Excuse me, he snapped, stepping forward, desperate to reclaim control. I don't care who you are. This woman has been terminated for gross misconduct. She stole hospital property. The warmth vanished from Jackson's expression. Terminated, he repeated slowly, as if tasting something foul. Yes, Sterling said, straightening his tie. She's a liability. Jackson let out a short, humorless laugh. He turned slightly to his team. Boys, did you hear that? The suit thinks the White Witch is a liability. A low chuckle rippled through the operators, not friendly, not amused. It was the sound of men who had survived hell and were not impressed by paperwork. Sterling frowned. The what? Jackson stepped into Sterling's space, forcing the administrator to tilt his head back to meet his gaze. In the Korengal Valley, in places you've never heard of, we called her the White Witch. Because only magic brings men back from the dead the way she did. He turned back to Quinn, his voice softening again. He noticed her shaking hands, the fear she hadn't yet mastered. We didn't come to say hello, he said gently. We came because we owe you a debt. A life debt. I was just doing my job, Quinn whispered. I wasn't even supposed to be there. That's exactly why it mattered, Jackson replied. When the ambush happened, you didn't run. You came toward the fire. Sterling sputtered, You're trespassing. Jackson reached into his vest and pulled out a thick roll of cash. You said she stole antibiotics. How much? Sterling hesitated. Maybe, 2,000. With fines. Jackson tossed the entire stack at his chest. Bills scattered across the floor. Keep the change, Jackson said flatly. Buy yourself a spine. Then he turned back to Quinn and offered his hand. Grab your bag, Mom, he said. We've got a meeting to get to. Quinn looked at the fallen money, at Sterling scrambling on his knees, at the hospital that had discarded her without hesitation. Her world had cracked open. And standing before her was the proof that what she thought was her greatest failure, had once made her a legend. The sound of rain faded, replaced by the dry hiss of wind over sand. Quinn Vance blinked, and the hospital lobby vanished. She was 34 again, standing under the brutal Afghan sun, the air thick with dust and diesel fumes. The clinic sat on the edge of Kandahar province, a cluster of canvas tents and concrete barriers that everyone insisted was a green zone. Quinn had believed it then. She had believed goodwill and bandages could keep the world from bleeding. She was wrong. The explosion came without warning. A massive IED detonated near the convoy gate, the shockwave slamming into Quinn like a physical blow. She was thrown sideways into a rack of metal trays, instruments clattering across the floor. The ground shook. Alarms screamed to life. Mass casualty inbound, a voice shouted over the PA, all medical personnel to triage. This is not a drill. Quinn ran. She didn't grab a helmet. She didn't grab a vest. Training evaporated, replaced by instinct. Smoke poured over the gate as trucks screeched to a halt, their sides torn open by shrapnel and bullets. This wasn't a standard patrol. It was a ghost team. Men were dragged from a shattered Humvee, blood pooling in the sand. Screams cut through the chaos. The air smelled of cordite and iron. We need a surgeon, someone yelled. Quinn looked around. Dr. Ferris, the camp physician, stood frozen, staring at a severed limb in the dirt. His face was pale, his hands useless. That was when Quinn saw him. A young soldier lay on a stretcher, barely conscious. His throat was torn by shrapnel, his chest rising unevenly, one leg twisted at a grotesque angle. His blue eyes were wide with terror. Jackson. He tried to speak, but only bubbles of blood escaped his lips. Something inside Quinn snapped into place. She grabbed Dr. Ferris by the shoulders. "Move," she said, her voice low and absolute. "We operate now." "We can't," Ferris stammered. "Too many. Too much damage." Quinn shoved past him. "Prep the O." "I'm scrubbing in." "You're a nurse," an orderly protested. Quinn met his eyes. "Then watch me become more." Inside the operating tent, the heat was suffocating. Sweat ran down her spine as she assessed Jackson's injuries. The real killer was hidden, a nicked jugular, a collapsed lung. He was drowning from the inside. "Clamp," she ordered. "I don't know which." Quinn took the instrument herself and stopped the bleeding. Blood sprayed her goggles, but her hands never shook. Then the monitor screamed. "Flatline." "Call it," someone whispered. "No," Quinn growled. She began chest compressions, cracking a rib beneath her palms. "You are not dying here," she told the boy. "You have a mother. I won't let you do this to her." They were out of epinephrine. Quinn smashed open the restricted lockbox with an oxygen wrench, ignoring the consequences. She injected the drug and stared into Jackson's lifeless eyes. "Live," she commanded. For endless seconds, nothing happened. Then, beep. Beep beep. A heartbeat. Quinn sagged in relief, unaware that the war outside was closing in, and that her greatest test had only just begun. The black SUVs tore through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago, engines growling as they cut across lanes with practiced aggression. Quinn Vance sat in the back seat, wedged between Jackson and a mountain of a man everyone called Tiny, her heart still pounding from what had just happened in the hospital lobby. The city light streaked past the tinted windows, blurred and unreal. Quinn stared at her trembling hands, trying to make sense of the impossible. Moments ago, she had been a fired nurse with nowhere to go. Now she was being escorted by armed operators who treated her like a commanding officer. "You remember, don't you?" Jackson asked quietly. Quinn nodded, swallowing hard. "I remember everything." Before Jackson could reply, the SUV slowed. A massive steel gate loomed ahead, crowned with razor wire. Armed guards stepped out of a booth, glanced at the vehicle, and waved them through without a word. "O'Hare's Military Annex," Jackson said. "Hangar 4. The jet waited on the tarmac, matte black, unmarked, engines already spooling. The moment the doors opened, the night exploded into chaos. A black sedan screamed onto the runway. Men in suits poured out, weapons raised. "Federal agents," a voice shouted. "Halt." Jackson swore. "Get on the plane, Quinn. Now." Gunfire erupted. Bullets sparked against metal, ricocheting off the jet stairs. Tiny laid down suppressive fire as Jackson shoved Quinn forward. She stumbled, scraping her shin, but adrenaline carried her upward. The roar of engines swallowed the sound of shouting as she dove into the cabin. "Seal it!" Jackson yelled. The door slammed shut. The jet lurched forward violently, throttles pushed to maximum without clearance. Quinn was thrown against a bulkhead as the plane tore down the runway and clawed into the sky under fire. Silence followed, heavy, stunned. "You okay, Mom?" Jackson asked, scanning her for wounds. "I'm fine," Quinn said automatically. "Where's the patient?" "In back." The jet's rear cabin had been converted into a flying trauma bay. General Miller lay pale and motionless on the table, chest seals already soaked through with blood. Monitors screamed their warning. Quinn didn't hesitate. "Tension pneumothorax," she said instantly. "I need a needle." The plane dropped suddenly in turbulence, but Quinn's hand stayed steady as she decompressed the chest. Air hissed free. Miller gasped. "Vitals rising," Jackson reported. "He's not out of danger," Quinn said. "I'm going in." At 30,000 feet, with no margin for error, she opened his chest. The world narrowed to flesh, blood, and precision. Jackson passed instruments. Tiny held the retractor with white-knuckled focus. 2 hours later, Quinn tied the final suture. He's stable. Relief washed through her, leaving her weak and shaking. That was when the truth came out. The patient Quinn had saved at Mercy General hadn't been homeless. He'd been an operative carrying evidence of massive corruption. The SD card now rested in her scrub pocket, placed there because he trusted her more than anyone else. Her firing hadn't been an accident. It had been an attempt to isolate her. Jackson looked at her steadily. You can't go back, Quinn. But you don't have to be alone. He handed her a flight suit, dark and unmarked, with a ghost patch on the shoulder. We need a healer who isn't afraid to break rules, he said. We need you. Quinn stared at the suit, at the life it represented. Then she reached for her stethoscope. Let's get to work, she said. And for the first time in years, she knew exactly where she belonged. 3 months later, the sun was sinking low over the Nevada desert, turning the sky copper and gold. Heat shimmered above the tarmac of a private airfield so remote it didn't exist on most maps. Inside a massive, climate-controlled hangar, the atmosphere was calm, efficient, and quietly intense. Men and women moved with purpose, their voices low, their movements precise. At the center of it all walked Quinn Vance. She no longer wore scrubs. Instead, she wore a tailored tactical medical uniform, reinforced at the shoulders and knees, practical and unadorned. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back into a clean ponytail, and a radio earpiece rested comfortably against her ear. A clipboard was tucked under one arm, her posture confident, grounded. Team 3, check your vitals monitor, she said into the mic as she walked. You're trending high on the stress test. A crackle of static answered her. Copy that, document. Just trying to keep up with the old man. Quinn smiled faintly and continued forward. She entered the main briefing room, where General Miller stood at the head of a digital map, fully recovered, his presence commanding but calm. Jackson sat nearby, methodically sharpening a combat knife, his focus absolute. Status? Miller asked. All teams green, Quinn replied without hesitation. Medical resupply came in an hour ago. Enough antibiotics to treat a small army. A hint of dry humor crossed her face. And this time, I didn't have to steal them. Miller chuckled. Old habits die hard. The room felt less like a command center and more like a family gathering before a storm. These people trusted one another. They depended on one another. And for the first time in decades, Quinn felt the quiet certainty that she belonged. An alarm sounded. A red icon flashed on the screen. Distress beacon, the comms officer announced. South America. Humanitarian convoy captured by cartel forces. 12 hostages, including 3 doctors. Local government refuses to intervene. The room shifted instantly. Jackson stood, sliding his knife into its sheath. The casual atmosphere vanished, replaced by focus sharpened to a blade. Spin up the bird, he ordered. Wheels up in 10. He turned to Quinn. Ma'am, you coming? Quinn didn't hesitate. She moved to her station and lifted her trauma kit, a far cry from the cheap tote bag she once carried through hospital halls. She checked her stethoscope, the same one her father had given her years ago, and secured it around her neck. Try not to get shot this time, she said lightly, meeting Jackson's eyes. I'm running low on O-negative. No promises, he replied with a grin. As the team jogged toward the hangar doors, the setting sun caught the ghost patch on Quinn's shoulder. She felt the weight of her past fall away, years spent thinking her life had narrowed, that her best days were buried in Afghan dust or hospital corridors. She had been wrong. She wasn't an aging nurse discarded for caring too much. She wasn't a liability. She was a force. As Quinn stepped onto the ramp of the black jet, surrounded by the most dangerous men on earth, men who treated her with reverence, she finally understood the truth. She was the White Witch. And she was exactly where she was meant to be. The engines roared, the ramp closed, and Quinn didn't look back. There were lives to save.